Welcome back to Module 3, Reforming Ohio. The Rockefeller videos focused on a robber baron, a ruthless, unscrupulous plutocrat who nevertheless saw himself as a reformer, someone who improved capitalism by abandoning quaint traditions like competition and small independent shops. These traditions, Rockefeller believed, shackled the economy. Releasing Americans from these traditions, again according to Rockefeller, allowed him to democratize access to an important if mundane technology: kerosene. Today our focus is on a scoundrel, the boss of Cincinnati's political machine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. George Cox was his name, and though he held only minor offices for a brief time, he controlled City Hall. He enriched himself and his friends at the expense of the public. He built a monopoly on political power. He made a mockery of free and fair elections. And yet, like Rockefeller, his story is more than just an accounting of his transgressions. In one sense, our lecture today is about the reckoning for the Cincinnati model. What does that mean? Reckoning in this context means to be called to account for one's actions. It's that moment when what you did in the past catches up to you in the present. And the Cincinnati model? That refers to the Miami slaughterhouse, that industrial system that regimented and divided human labor into small, unskilled, repetitive tasks, that degraded the environment by polluting the air and water and soil, that cheapened human life in the pursuit of profit. Cincinnati pioneered that model for Ohio, but by 1900 the rest of Ohio's cities were following suit. And so by the late 19th century, there was a growing sense among Ohioans that Ohio was retrogressing. Rewards from industrialization and urbanization were poorly distributed, as wealth, comfort, opportunity, and power could be found only in the richest of neighborhoods. The chance of birth determined your future rather than any old-fashioned notion of democratic, meritocratic opportunity. It seemed that Ohio was a promised land for fewer and fewer detached and ridiculously rich plutocrats. And, as in the Miami slaughterhouse, the rest of Ohio's industrial cities faced ethnic and racial divisions. In particular, immigration by 1900 had changed. No longer were most immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe. Instead, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, Russia, and the Mediterranean filled Ohio's cities. And both whites and African Americans from the South found Ohio cities as they looked to escape the continuing domination of cotton. Of course, Ohio cities were not ready for this explosive growth. Their sewers were, at best, configured for pre-Civil War communities. And technological change exacerbated the problem. For example, the electric streetcar made people more mobile than they had been when Ohio cities were first built. Throughout the 19th century, cities were called walking cities, cities in which the main mode of transportation for most people was walking. That kept cities dense, compact. And so infrastructure was dense and compact too. But the streetcar pulled people away from the core of the city, allowing them more options on where to live and to work. That meant the city's infrastructure, water and sewer service, and fire and police protection, chief among them, had to expand as well. But that was expensive. So by the late 19th century, many Americans lived and died with inadequate infrastructure. And of course, that meant environmental degradation. And that meant that cities were places of violence and poverty and disease amidst wealth, comfort, and technology. Ohioans responded to the chaos of the city in a variety of ways, but Cincinnati's reforms were especially unique, and that was because of George Cox. Cox was born in Cincinnati in 1853, the son of British immigrants. He was, to put it mildly, indifferently educated. He dropped out of elementary school and went to work to help support the family. He worked a variety of jobs. For example, he was for a while a lookout for gamblers. That is, he stood at the corner watching and warning the gamblers who were down the alley or inside the bar for when the police neared or possible thieves approached. And as a young man, he bought a saloon at the corner of Longworth and John Streets, a corner sometimes called Dead Man's Corner because of the unfortunate but all too regular occurrence of a dead body being dumped there in the middle of the night. Throughout his political career, the saloon was his office, the place where he could be found in case you needed to ask a favor or get approval to pave a street or get a job for your newly arrived immigrant cousin. So, what brought Cox to power? In March of 1884, Cincinnati was literally on fire. A murder trial ended when a jury convicted a clearly guilty man of manslaughter rather than murder. The defendant was politically connected, and so for several days mobs tried to attack the courthouse, intent on lynching the man and intent on delivering their kind of justice. The state militia was called in to quell the unrest, but they seemed only to make the problem worse. And after 3 days of rioting, the courthouse had been burned down, 54 people had been killed, and another 200 were wounded. But this riot wasn't really about the trial of one man. The trial only let loose pent-up frustrations among Cincinnati's residents. Beginning in the 1870s, the city had experienced severe national economic depressions, crime waves, and floods. City leaders seemed incapable of leading. The courthouse signaled a crisis in public authority. The riot was a message from the people. The protected classes and the distant, unresponsive institutions of local government had abandoned us. And so, with the tacit approval of the city's Republican elites, George Cox took power, promising to create order out of chaos. Elites lived in the hills in the northern part of the city, away from the stench and despair of the core city. But they worked in the core. They went to the opera and art museum in the core. They wanted the core safe and healthy. For these elites, efficiency, getting things done, was more important than the old William Holmes McGuffey sermons on character and sobriety. And so, from the 1880s through 1911, Boss Cox built a political machine that controlled every aspect of local government. His power base was in the racially and ethnically diverse working class neighborhoods. Cox's government tried to build and protect these neighborhoods by extending city services there, by employing the residents in patronage jobs, or by organizing charity drives. And through the machine, he doled out favors to different groups based on their loyalty, not based on their tribal identity. Cities in America at this time were places driven often by hatred. The Italians hated the Greeks hated the Hungarians hated the Czechs hated the Russians. The Irish hated everybody, and everybody hated the blacks. But the machine didn't eliminate those hatreds, it simply tried to mitigate the worst side effects of the hatred by spreading favors around. It built coalitions, in other words, across these ethnic neighborhoods. So here's what Boss Cox's machine did. It democratized access to public authority. During Cox's reign, Cincinnati residents saw their city improve. He modernized and professionalized police and fire services, requiring training and exams to weed out poor candidates. He regularized trash pickup and upgraded and expanded the waterworks and sewer system so that more and more people were drinking water that was not tainted by their own waste. And he increased political participation. He encouraged African American voters, a remarkable act given the city's tense and violent race relations throughout its history. He also improved the city's vice industry. How? Prostitution and gambling were illegal under Cox, but his machine made arrangements to improve the services that these businesses offered. First, Cox decreased the number of establishments that could sell these services. He did that by harassing, arresting, and shutting down the saloons of his political enemies. A saloon was more than just a place to buy alcohol. In fact, alcohol was in many cases a lost leader. What's a lost leader? Well, think about a grocery store. They advertise a product for sale, let's say bananas for 39 cents a pound. Oh, great, I say, bananas are on sale. I'll go get some. Now, the store knows that once I'm in the door, I'll buy more than just bananas. In fact, they know I'll probably buy a pint of premium ice cream for $10. So they sold me cheap bananas just to get me to buy expensive ice cream. The saloon owners sold cheap booze to get customers to buy premium services, in this case, prostitution and gambling. So, after Cox shut down the saloons of his political opponents, he allowed his political friends to keep their saloons open. But they had to pay for this privilege in two ways. First, a kickback to the machine, of course, but also they paid a tax to pay for weekly medical exams and medical care for the prostitutes. Each brothel had to have a certificate to operate. So this represented the de facto legalization of gambling and prostitution in Cincinnati. These improvements maintained elite interest in the city. They got what they wanted, a city that was at least somewhat safer and healthier than it had ever been, a government that actually seemed to work in the interests of the people, and a city that was, as a result, less prone to mob violence. Perhaps the most important elites in the city was the Taft family. The Tafts are really one of the most underrated political dynasties in American history. William Howard Taft was both a president and a Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Robert, his son, was a longtime U.S. Senator. His grandson, also named Robert, was a U.S. Congressman as well as a senator. And his great grandson, also named Robert, was a two-term governor of Ohio. This dynasty got its start in part because of their ties to Boss Cox. I think these things make Cox a liberator. He used the power of local government to liberate people from the chaos of the city. And he tried to decrease the distance between the people and their government. By distance, I don't mean physical space. I mean emotional distance, emotional space. A sense that their government was theirs, that it consisted of people who spoke like they did, ate the same food that they did, and even had suffered from some of the same problems that they did. But let's be clear about the cost of Boss Cox and his machine. Cox believed that politics worked better when people cooperated rather than competed. Competition was wasteful and inefficient. So Cox went to the local Democratic leaders and said, "Take a look at my books. See how much money I have. If we go to war, I'll be able to outspend you, offer more patronage jobs, and deliver bigger bribes. But why should we waste our resources? Consider this deal," he said to the Democrats. "I'll reserve a certain number of patronage jobs and elected positions for you Democrats. And in return, you will kick back 40% of your salary to me. You'll have a job that won't require much work, and you'll be paid. If you don't agree, if you want to compete rather than cooperate, you'll have neither." Now, this deal should sound familiar to you. "Join me and prosper," Cox said, "or oppose me and get buried." The Cincinnati Democrats chose to join Cox. Boss Cox made the city run better through a monopoly on power. In 1911, a group of reformers overthrew Cox and his machine. They believed he was corrupt, too closely tied to prostitution and gambling. His machine seemed increasingly more about special privilege for the well-connected than about clearing slums and cleaning up an immoral city. Maybe, these reformers thought, old-fashioned character was more important than efficiency. He died in 1916, a rich man who lived well off the public.